visual ethics theory. In this lesson, I will take you around the question whether ethics applies to an art depiction such as a visual. There are different views from different scholars on this issue. Especially, the West is more concerned about the ethics in visual processes followed by the artists of 19th and 20th centuries. A country like India has certain defined ethics based on Indian epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Besides Upanishads, the situation in the West is not so clear. The society that does not oblige Bible or Quran is much larger than the believers in the ethics stipulated by these two great religious texts. The arguments of the postmodernists are that any ethics in which the visuals need to be depicted, it should lie outside the periphery of ethics stipulated by any religious text. As such, there cannot be any ethics without a consensus. While this has created a rift between traditional and postmodern philosophers, there is no unanimity among the postmodern scholars on what such ethics should be. Today, it is concern of postmodernists than anybody else. Newton, referring to his own works in the past, offers a balanced view of the situation in the West, from which I have taken a lot of excerpts for explaining the nugget of this understanding for your enlightenment as students of visual communication. To inform the student about, is there an ethic unique to the visual? If so, what is it and how does it operate? To enlighten the student as to how can we study it, to enrich the knowledge of the learner as to how can we use what we learn to improve the ways people use the visual to make a meaning and interact with it. Philosophical dilemma, traditional and contemporary complexities. The visual for long has been a subject of philosophy. Plato once said that human hunt for shadow of illusions over near binding reality. Aristotle argues that a visual has a cathartic potential. One of the most influential explorations of visual perception during the Enlightenment centuries was the philosopher Bishop George Berkeley's essay Towards a New Theory of Vision. Berkeley based his argument for the existence of God on observation. According to Newton, philosophers have so often linked the visual with the study of the ethical, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. 19th century philosopher and cultural critic Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, argued that art facilitated the emergence of higher humanity and a higher morality. 20th century postmodernists, on the other hand, targeted the visual as the evil incarnate source of a host of societal ills, ranging from the misguided belief in objective reality to the procreator of spectator culture and government surveillance. This lesson aims to articulate the central concern of visual theory that relate to visual ethics. Newton argues that the ethical systems derived from the central concerns of living entities and have profound implication for life. Human beings tend to believe that most of the ethical systems are based on reason. We believe our ethics are logic based. Those who live within an ethical system usually think the system is universal. Those who live outside an ethical system often can relate principles of that system to cultural norms rather than universals. Newton further argues that traditional literature of Western ethics is grounded in classical philosophy originating with the Greek Golden Age. As a core branch of classical philosophy, ethics focuses on the study of morality, which overlaps with the issues of existence and reality and knowledge. Traditional Western ethics might pose the questions: how does a person decide what is right and what is wrong? How do we define right and wrong? These questions are exemplified in Socrates' famous assertion that the unexamined life is not worth living. Contemporary ethicist Bernard Williams stressed an important corollary: the serious enterprise is living, and we have to live after reflection. Moreover, we have to live during it as well, grounding the pursuit of ethical wisdom in the reality of everyday existence. At the same time, Western ethics have been rooted in religious practice stemming from various branches of Judeo-Christian beliefs. Their goal is to guide behavior in directions that will result in transcendence into eternal beneficence. In contemporary ethical theory, we have applied classical philosophy and theology creation of a specific field known as media ethics. Media ethics explores a range of issues related to the mass media, such as free expression in print publications and regulation of violent content in films, television programming and internet. Recent theory has led to work in representational issues, stereotyping, manipulative advertising and altering images of photojournalism, says Newton. Philosophers and media ethicists think about such issues through years of study, contemplation, reflection, writing, arguing, and reasoning. They may put ethics into two categories: teleological or goal-oriented, or deontological or rule-oriented. They may argue such positions as the greater good for the greatest number, utilitarianism or absolute right of wrong, Kantian categorical imperative. Media ethicists might pose such question as: does the media conveyed message mislead or deceive? Does the message bring harm to someone? Does viewing violent imagery make someone more violent? Media scholars explore those questions through qualitative and quantitative research as well as through the logic of traditional ethics. Yet the mythology of reason promoted by majority of serious thinkers during the 20th century enveloped non-rational responses within a web of irrationally deemed inferior and primitive scholarly and popular wisdom, alike relegated the visual long associated with artistic expression and emotion to a position beneath and in opposition to the verbal, and to a marginalized status in regard to human needs. As a consequence, the visual became de facto undesirable and by extension not trustworthy, by further extension associated with the unethical. The visual was not so easily subsumed. However, ironically, the 19th century, which McLuhan and Powers labelled the visual age, had bred visual inventions that would revolutionize humankind's abilities to extend the mind and heart beyond the body. Building on the invention of photography and then the motion of picture, the visual pulsed forward, extending our perceptual capacities around and beyond the earth. The ultimate manifestation of this extension of sight is the virtual, a form of visual that projects outward through holography and other computer generated imagery, as well as inward through digitally enhanced visualization. By the late 20th century, neuroscientists had determined that humans operate from perceptual bases that are more often unconsciously or intuitively oriented than rationally discerned. Contrary to popular and scholarly wisdom engendered by the mythology of reason, the assumed superiority of rational thinking processes, often intuitive processes, shifting into a recognition of the need for both. Neuroscientists Antonio Damasio, Bechara, Tranel, and Joseph Lee Dox, for example, discovered evidences that the human feeling-based response system of unconscious cognitive processing and emotion is integral to good decision making, whether conscious or unconscious. We are learning how information discerned through our eyes, through the vision, is a major source of information for decision making and for determining how to act or react to stimuli. Furthermore, new research on dreaming and interpersonal visual activity indicates that humans use dreams to explore the problems of the previous day and to work out strategies for living. Most of this visual information is processed cognitively on unconscious levels and influence behavior prior to rational cognition or awareness. Evidence supporting strong links among the visual, human action and ethics is mounting. Most important for our current discussion is the work visual scholars are doing to determine the role visual plays in these rational and intuitive processing systems. Key themes include visual communication as a primary way of knowing. Visual processing of information is at least as important as verbal processing. Visual intelligence, we can cultivate sophisticated understanding of the ways visual media manipulate us. Cognitive balance, we can learn to balance years of rational training in contemporary education systems by accessing our intuitive processing abilities through integration of multiple literacies. Traditional Western approaches to discussions of ethics typically draw on only a small part of the brain, and they typically focus on anthropocentric concerns. Such bases for ethical systems ignore millennia of life philosophies set forth by such Eastern thinkers as Confucius and the Buddha, by the African and South American traditions, and by indigenous people throughout the world. An interesting contemporary development in ethical theory is recent work by Western scholars who locate their arguments in the non-human but living other of the Earth's environment. Furthermore, the upheaval of thought manifested in postmodernism rearranged the ways we think about many ethical inquiries regarding such as concepts as self, other reality, truth representations. Another specifically relevant 20th century theoretical development in the social sciences grew in tandem with theoretical physicist. Heisenberg demonstrated in 1927 that the very act of measuring location of subatomic particles affected their velocity and vice versa. In observing ourselves, social scientist L. Babel noted, since Heisenberg's contribution of the uncertainty principle, researchers in subatomic physics have increasingly attempted to include the observer in their understanding of the observer. Although social scientists acknowledged similar issues through the Hawthorne effect or the idea that observing a person affects the person's behavior, it would be the 1970s before they would incorporate that concept into their work. Mead and Bateson set the stage with their seminal work shifting understanding of the camera eye from the non-neutral mechanism to purposive extension of individual perception. Visual sociologist Douglas Harper was among the first to turn the tables on that proposition, asking whether participant observers even had the right to take a camera into their fieldwork. Newton combined concern for subject rights with the concern to representing reality in her investigation of using photography in fieldwork. In image ethics, Gross, Karch and Ruby applied such concerns to media representation. In the same year, John Tagg published his exploration of the social implications of photography's use in public institutions. Paul Lester would articulate a growing concern for the ethics of photojournalism practice, and in 1995, Sheila Reeves published her empirical investigation into digital photojournalism. Definitions. We can define ethics in a number of ways in common everyday use. When we say someone is highly ethical, we usually mean that person consistently makes choices based on discerning what is right and what is wrong, rather than on what is wrong and bad. Right usually means what is correct. Good usually means beneficent. But the problem is that what is correct, what is good must be judged against a standard. And who sets that standard? We know, for example, that by Catholic standard, personal confession through a priest is a primary route to forgiveness and redemption. By a Protestant's standard, personal confession directly to God is necessary. Does that mean that one or the other is unethical simply because he or she follows different rituals of self-confrontation? Many believe ethics are highly personal, best determined through one's own processes. Yet ethics are also highly public in that they affect and are affected by other people and activities. The term visual typically refers to observable stimuli, either the process of seeing or the external something that can be seen by the eyes. We define light itself as the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. However, it is estimated that visual processing is only ocular, 90% is cognitive. We also know that individuals who do not see light create visual worlds in their minds. For our discussion here then, visual refers to images of all kinds of dreams, imagination, art, self, handwriting, cyberspace, even the letter forms you are reading at this moment, and to all forms of image making, physical and metaphysical. Visual media therefore range from print through virtual, which includes imaginary forms. Visual ethics also includes a number of areas less commonly associated with an ethic of the visual: self-image, interpersonal and intrapersonal communication, reality construction, virtual reality, perception, postmodernism, psychology, feminism, critical theory, political communication, social and physical science. Just as we can find an ethical component of just about any area of thought or action in life, we can find a visual component to just about anything and an ethical component to anything visual. To summarize, by visual I mean images and imaging. By ethics I refer to the study of right and wrong and to the human pursuit of a beneficent life. By virtual ethics I meant the study of right and wrong, use of images and imaging. However, the central concern of visual ethics go deeper than those simple definitions might lead you to believe. Visual ethics, according to Newton, is the study of how images and imaging affect the ways we think, feel, create, use and interpret meaning, for good or for bad. Visual ethics includes the study of how we create and use images in communicating with others and ourselves. Visual ethics is not just digital ethics or truth in advertising, public relations or TV journalism. It is not just avoiding imagery that stereotypes or imagery that subjugates others. Visual ethics is about the soul of communication. In the manner of the classic metaphor, the eyes are the windows to the soul. By soul I mean that immaterial entity that makes something what it is. So the soul of communication refers to an almost indescribable yet knowable aspect of meaning making, conveying and interpreting that makes it possible for one living thing to see what another living thing is about and to act on that knowledge. Visual ethics also is about everyday birth of the spirit through countless acts of visual beauty, harmony and authenticity. It is about the visual search for beneficence within a world that is too often maleficent, or at least for a balance of the two ends of the continuum of human behavior. A theoretical anchoring. So, the process of imaging and therefore, the process of seeing itself can be ethical or unethical. Taking the visual beyond seeing, that is a step further to include how people will use seeing to judge or image someone, illustrates the potentially profound implications of an ethic of the visual. The emphasis is placed on the processes, the action, the behavior, rather than on the manifestation of that process as a product or medium. The analytical emphasis in such a framework is the image itself and whether it is fine art or something to be censored. Ecological theory avoids analysis of hierarchies or describe actions in favor of or nested dynamic series of shifts, each leading to other shifts in an unending flow of activity. Consider several layers or nests of in behavior in which a human organism participates. First, it is a surface layer which includes attending and perceiving. Second is an interpretative layer which includes recognizing and translating and recording. Third is an interactive layer in which we construct, create and conceptualize, manipulate. In this layer, we image self, other, group and world. We leave our individual minds to interact with other minds in some way, either interpersonally or in a group way. Finally, in a fourth layer, we achieve mesh with them, succumb to and overtake the power of other entities, layers of behavior. In this way, we engage in an ecology of the visual in which the conscious and unconscious, overt and covert, individual and collective, local and universal, physical and cultural nest through a continual dynamic process of being, interacting and meaning making. Human visual behavior. Recent developments in ecological theory have led to the recognition that complexity and chaos are key components of any system rather than purely predictable deterministic stasis. Newton defines human visual behavior as a fleeting spot, a constantly shifting movement of awareness in which I can momentarily consciously observe myself as well as others and adjust my responses as I become more aware of them and of their effects on me and others. Acknowledging this existential continuum in which each of us as one living organism among mainly participates focuses the current discussion in important ways. First, we have only moments in which to be aware of the fact that we are doing something. For example, if I look at a photograph of someone and think derisive thoughts about her, at that moment I am engaged in an act with ethical consequences. The consequences may never reach the person imaged in the photo unless I know or encounter that individual, and my defensive memories affect how I interact with the person or influence others to interact with her in certain ways. The consequences do touch me, however, because at some level I know what I thought. That thought in and of itself has an effect on me, either positively or negatively, rightly or wrongly. That effect can be minuscule, a fleeting moment of derisiveness that will nevertheless return to affect my perceptions, either consciously or unconsciously. On the other hand, that effect can be major. The derisive thoughts malign the person in the photo and through the process malign me, their creator, as well as other life forms to which they are transferred. In that way, my behavior of viewing and deriding the person in the photograph has rippled outward from my momentary action and back again. One way to conceptualize this process is to consider all of those activities: the walking, learning, being of the observed, seeing, interpreting and knowing of the observer forms of human visual behavior. Newton's argument is based on an altruistic concept that human is but a place to start, because human is what we who are writing and reading this book know best. We can conceptualize human visual behavior in a number of ways. Most obvious is observable action, those movements by parts of the body that we can see as they occur. Note that it does a disservice to visual behavior to call gestures and body movements non-verbal behavior, in that it posits the visual in negative relationship to the verbal. Less obvious are incidents observable only in the mind of the seer, such as thinking of one's own childhood while watching a 9-year-old girl run through a meadow. Into this category fall activities like dreaming visualization, meditation, unconscious visual cognition and memory and creative thinking. Process and meaning. Conceptualizing visual ethics as an ecological system of human behavior helps explain two aspects of visual knowing: the ethics of processes and the ethics of meaning. Ethics of process refers to how the visual was made, created and constructed. In other words, did a photographer psychologically harm a grieving mother by making an image of her at her child's funeral, or did a politician purposefully deceive the public by agreeing to a campaign ad that falsely maligned his opponent? In the first instance, ethics of process involved how the photographer approached a sensitive situation, how the photographer decided to photograph the grieving mother, whether the mother has agreed to the photograph, whether the public really needed to see a picture of that particular mother in a state of deep despair. In the second instance, ethics of process involved a candidate, campaign manager and an advertiser deciding to create 30 seconds of video that would lead potential voters to believe something negative about another political candidate. We can use the same examples to describe ethics of meaning. In the grieving mother's example, what does the photographer of her crying mean? Does it mean look at her, everyone can understand her sorrow? Does it mean look at her, see how well this photographer covers difficult events? Does it mean parents, please do not let this happen to your child? Does it mean look at this, so you will buy this magazine? In the political and ad example, ethics of meaning are partially determined by whether the ad is truthful, false or misleading. The two modes of analyzing a visual usually overlap. In the ethics of process, the harm can be done to the image maker, to any individual involved in the process, to the message itself, to the viewer and to the society at large. Harm can be done to the image maker, to any individual involved in the process, to the message itself, to the viewer and or to the society at large. Unethical processes can produce either ethical or unethical messages, as can ethical processes. Unethical messages can in turn produce either unethical or unethical processes, as can ethical messages. Matrix appears to cover the range of possible combinations of processes and meaning in terms of ethics. The problem is that ethics seldom is so easily categorized, but rather flows along a continuum of possibilities. An ecology which can be visualized as a Mobius strip can encompass that continuum. One way to explain this is to visualize the ethics of visual behavior as an ecology of the visual in the form of the tetrad graphic created for the global village, Marshall McLuhan and Powers. The graphic designed by Blair working with Marshall McLuhan and Bruce Powers accompanied a 4-part analysis to predict cultural change revealed by media effects. If we apply the tetrad structure to the concept of constantly shifting emerging ecology of the visual, we can conceptualize the foregrounding of a visual behavior, backgrounding another behavior, retrieving a behavior into the foreground, reversing into still another behavior, as shown in figure 26.2. The original intent of the tetrad graphic was that it represents simultaneous, constantly moving, connected cultural phenomena, a continuous process. Powers explains applications of the tetrad as an analytical aid vary according to individual interpretation of a phenomenon and cannot represent all phenomena. Although the activity appears to be sequential, linear and reactive, it occurs in a fleeting, timeless, mutually emergent instant. Adapted to human visual behavior, which often but not necessarily occurs in response to other behavior or external stimuli, the tetrad structure incorporates phenomena that may be simultaneous and mutually emerging, or occur in sequences of milliseconds, or occur in a sequence of miscellaneous or millennia. Also important to applying, the tetrad does not flow really neatly from A to B to C to D, but in a flurry of initial insights. The tetrad might vault from A to D at the same time leap from B to C, incorporating momentary chaos or spontaneity. Nevertheless, a naturally developed tetrad will eventually reflect a balance of complementarity A, B as C, D. To apply the tetrad in visual ethics, let us argue for the sake of example that when a power is in a visual interaction is exchanged equally, the ecology of the visual is maintained. For example, consider the visual behavior of one person extending his hand to another person. See figure 26.3. The extension enhances or foregrounds the power of the extender. The person observing the action is momentarily backgrounded until she makes an intuitive, instantaneous judgment of the intention of the hand extender. If she determines the extension to be friendly, her power is retrieved or foregrounded. She extends her hand, reversing the behavior into one that of background, or reverses the power of the extender. Then the process of the visual behavior continues. We can extend the discussion to media imagery by acknowledging that all human visual behavior between humans is to some extent mediated activity negotiated through a mutually dependent, mutually emerging process. We cannot see or directly experience the inner workings of another person's mind. We respond to external indicators of those inner workings, yet at the same time the manifestations are part of the behavior and part of the process and continually shifting meaning construction. Through the process and meaning of visual behavior, we exert personal and group power in the creation and use of imagery internally and externally. That power can dominate or uplift, stereotype or enrich, deceive or validates. As an example, consider an act of stereotyping which is generally accepted as a negative and unethical, but nevertheless recurring behavior in mass media. Our visual system of knowing and communicating is fundamental to our survival. Any discussion of human survival necessarily involves power, which in turn involves ethics. The way we create visual messages, consume visual information and store visual information affects the way we live, interact and concern ourselves in unique ways. Determining the best way to live is a core concern of ethics. Visual stimuli are powerful because they are arbiters of the reality we perceive, which necessarily affects the way we live that reality. 75% of all information entering the brain is visual. If most of what we know is derived from the visual operates as the major source of stimuli on which we rely to form our perception of reality that subsequently guides our behavior. One way to grasp the complexity of the visual is to conceptualize it in ecological terms as synergistic, interdependent system of human behavior, exemplifying a dynamic process of meaning making. Through that process, we live a continuum empowerment and disempowerment, a continuum of ethical and unethical interaction. The tetrad structure offers one way to visually plot various continua for study. 75% of all information entering the brain is visual. If most of what we know is derived from the visual operates as the major source of stimuli on which we rely to form our perception of reality that subsequently guides our behavior. One way to grasp the complexity of the visual is to conceptualize it in ecological terms as synergistic, interdependent system of human behavior, exemplifying a dynamic process of meaning making. Through that process, we live a continuum empowerment and disempowerment, a continuum of ethical and unethical interaction. The tetrad structure offers one way to visually plot various continua for study.